By the end of this video, sequence knitting will have done one of three things to your brain. It will be broken, it will be blown, or you'll have had a brain party. I had a brain party. Sequence knitting is simple-ish, fascinating, meditative, and can be deceptively tricky, but I'll have some tips for you to make it easier. If you're intrigued by all this mystery around sequence knitting, meet me in the lounge. Here we go, all things sequence knitting. When I discovered sequence knitting, I definitely had a brain party. I guess my brain was a little bit broken, a little bit blown, but mostly party, and it's been party ever since. Sequence knitting is the invention of Cecelia Campochiaro. Here's Cecelia. She is one of the smartest knitters I've ever come across. I'm pretty sure I talked about her before in the marling video. It's not that sequence knitting hasn't existed before, because sequence knitting exists. Sequence knitting is just knit 2, purl 2. Knit 2, purl 2 is a 4-stitch sequence. It's just that we've pretty much always done knit 2, purl 2 exactly the same way. If we change things up a little bit, we get something completely different. So Cecelia didn't invent it. She unvented it, as the late great Elizabeth Zimmerman would say. It's just that no one before Cecelia has written it up or studied it the way she has. Before I show you what it is and how it's done, here are the sources that you're going to want to have if sequence knitting intrigues you enough to want to play with it some more. And no martini today because it's 8 a.m. and that would just be silly. So I just have coffee, but maybe I could put my coffee in my martini glass. Maybe not. But I am using a martini pick to hold my shawl together. This book from Modern Daily Knitting, this is one of their field guides called, go figure, Sequences. It's field guide number 5, was my first introduction to sequence knitting. This little book is what I would call a sequence knitting snack. I'll show you more about this book in a minute. This book, which is all Cecilia's, called, go figure, Sequence Knitting, is the master course in sequence knitting. It's amazing. I will talk more about this book in a minute. So Cecelia says she first stumbled on sequence knitting when she saw Stephanie Pearl-McPhee's one-row handspun scarf. And that scarf intrigued her so much that she just started down the rabbit hole and ended up with this. In this book, you will find everything you could possibly ever want to know about sequence knitting. It's just fascinating. She has tried a bazillion different sequences in different methods and come up with so many textures. It's astonishing. I'm completely fascinated by this book. I debated with myself quite a bit about whether I should show you the samples of sequence knitting that I have, or if I should start with showing you what it is and how it's done. I've decided to show you first. And then you can look at the samples, because the samples might make more sense after you understand a little bit about how sequence knitting actually works. Here we go. What is sequence knitting? All it is taking a sequence of stitches like knit 2, purl 2 and repeating them over and over and over and over again over a particular number of stitches to create all kinds of different textured patterns. The sequences can be knit 2, purl 2, knit 3, purl 1, knit 4, purl 2, knit 7, knit 2, purl 6, knit 1, any combination and any length depending on how complex you want to get. Then you take that particular sequence, say knit 2, purl 2, you know that that's 4 stitches. So your sequence is a multiple of 4. And then how many stitches you cast on and which sequence method you use, you will get completely different fabric. So you could cast on a number of stitches that is a straight up multiple of 4, which is usually what we do when we do a knit 2 purl 2 rib, because we know that stacking knit 2 purl 2 and then repeating that on the next row gives us knit 2 purl 2 rib like this. However, if we cast on multiples of 4 and then add 2 more stitches, things can change up a little bit. So let's start with looking at a 1 row sequence knitting method. 1 row sequence knitting means that you're going to start the sequence at the beginning of the row. You're going to work that sequence repeated all the way across until you run out of stitches, even if that means you don't get to finish a sequence at the end of the row. When you turn around and start knitting back the other way, you just start the sequence at the beginning again. That's a 1 row sequence. I'm going to give you an example. So we looked up here. I'm sorry, my swatches are little. I have a limited amount of time to swatch for these videos, but I tried to give you one that was clear enough you could see what was going on without having to knit too much. You understand. All right, here we are. There's your knit 2 purl 2 rib. Now, down here, this is also a knit 2 purl 2 sequence, but this is a 1 row knit 2 purl 2 sequence done over multiples of 4 plus 2 stitches. So on the first pass, it was knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2, ending in knit 2. Okay? You with me so far? Knit 2 is the first half of the 4 stitch sequence, ending in knit 2, then turning around and starting again with knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2. What that means is that in each of these 2 stitch columns, they're actually garter stitched because we're stacking the knit 2s on top of each other and the purl 2s on top of each other and creating what's called a broken garter stitch. Cool, hey? So it's little columns of garter stitch that are shifted by a row in each column. I think it's so cool. So that is a 1 row sequence. There are 2 other kinds of sequences. There are also serpentine sequences where you go back and forth and just keep repeating the sequence over and over again. If you get to the end of the row and you're only halfway through the sequence, so for the rib, knit 2 purl 2, knit 2 purl 2 across, ending in knit 2, which is the first half of our sequence, when we flip it over and work back, we're starting with purl 2, the second half of the sequence, and going to the end. And then wherever we stopped in the sequence, when we turned again, we would start with the rest of that sequence before carrying on repeating the sequence. Have I said sequence enough times yet? Too bad. There's going to be more. So that one is called serpentine, where you complete the sequence on the following row if you didn't get to finish it on the first row. Clear as mud? And then the final version of sequences is spiral or knitting in the round. But Cecelia, because she is a very logical brain, understands fully that knitting in the round is actually knitting in a spiral. You are actually going up and up and up in a spiral. You're not knitting in the round, stopping, starting again, knitting in the round, stopping, starting again. It's a continuous spiral going up and up. So she calls it spiral. And it's another way to shift over the stitches as you work around. In the sequences snack, there is a pattern, a spiral sequence hat called the swirl hat. I just want to give a little plug for I have no sponsorship, no affiliation, no nothing, but I want to give a little plug for these MDK Field Guides. They are worth their weight in gold. You can order print copies like this tiny little one, or you can order ebook copies and download the PDF. The PDF version, I think, is like $10. The print version might be $1 or $2 more, plus whatever shipping's going to cost you. Each one is focused on a topic done by a single designer and contains at least 3 very cool patterns and tons of instruction, beautiful photography, little stories. They're just great. They're really worth it. So if you're curious at all about sequence knitting, please go to Modern Daily Knitting and check out this book. Sequence knitting can also be done in more than one color. So here's a little swatch I did of 2-color sequence knitting. I can't remember what this sequence was. Totally forgot. Let me look. This sequence was knit for purl 2, changing color every second row. But doesn't it look like complex and amazing? Because the pearls are intermixed with the sections of the little ribby sections of stockinette, you get these stripes with blended color in between. It's just fascinating to me how these very simple concepts can create such interesting and complex looking fabric. In the sequence book, there are tons of examples of different sequences done in 2 colors. They're quite amazing. Let's talk about this shawl. This is the Corrugated Shawl out of the MDK Field Guide on Sequences. Originally, I knit it to the pattern exactly as written, and it turned out to be 27 miles long. You can see here in this little video clip of me showing it 27 miles long. And I said in that video that I was planning to convert this into one of my wearable wrapovers. So I'm in the process of doing that. I had removed some of the sequences. Which end did I do that on? This end. I cut and removed a bunch of sequences and bound it off to make it shorter. And then I picked up all the stitches along the long edge. And now I'm in the process of adding some width to it, and then I will sew it up into one of my wearable wrapovers. In the meantime, this is what you've got. I was hoping to have this finished for this video. Didn't happen. So here it is. What you're looking at. See all these fantastic textured patterns? One after another, after another, after another. All of these textures are happening just based on short little stitch sequences. No charts. This right here is the whole pattern for this shawl. There's a knit 2, purl 2 sequence, 1 row method, which is what I showed you right here, the broken welt. There's a knit 2, purl 2 in serpentine, which gives you a knit 2, purl 2 rib. There's a knit 3, purl 1. There's knit 4, purl 4 in a couple of different ways. There's knit 3, purl 4, knit 1, knit 5, purl 3. You see what I'm see where I'm getting at? So each one of these is just a short sequence of stitches repeated over and over and over again. What creates the textured pattern is the number of stitches that it's worked across, and then it can be varied by changing up from doing it in the 1 row method or the serpentine method. The 1 row method tends to create these more ribby effects. The serpentine methods tend to create these more all over textured patterns. It's amazing, isn't it? It's so much fun to knit because all you have to do is remember knit 4, purl 3, and off you go. And it's fascinating to watch the pattern develop as you work your way down each section. And the other fantastic thing about it is it's really reversible. It is slightly different on both sides, but it looks cool on either side. In Cecelia's sequence knitting masterclass, she has charts that tell you what's going to happen on the reverse side, whether it's a perfect reverse or a slightly shifted reverse, or if it's just aesthetically pleasing on the reverse side, even though it's quite different. She's done all that experimentation for you, so you already know what you're going to get before you start knitting that particular sequence in that particular method over that multiple plus X. I'm sorry. Does your brain hurt yet? I understand. You really just need to get yourself one of these sources and try it out for yourself. It's simpler than it sounds. Trust me. Shut up, Oscar. Here are a couple other projects, one finished, one not. This is my car knitting. I talked about this car knitting a couple of videos ago. I think it was in the marling video. I said it was in the car in Vancouver with my handsome man. Well, I pulled it out of the car. We'll look at this one first because the sequence is easier to see on this one. This is Cecelia's Marlogram scarf, which actually is in the Modern Daily Knitting Field Guide on Marls. So you can find this sequence and marling combo in that field guide. In this one, I'm marling 2 strands of a long gradient together. And even though they're held together, the color changes happen just at slightly different points. So I'm getting a really nice gradient shift through here. I'm quite loving this, isn't it? Isn't it quite neato? And this sequence is knit 3, purl 3, knit 3, purl 1, which is a longer sequence. And I will tell you, the longer sequences are a little harder to keep track of. And I will say this, the only downside of sequence knitting is that you really need to stay on that sequence. If you make a mistake and you don't do the sequence perfectly every single time, it will throw off every single row thereafter. And whatever sequence you were knitting is going to turn into a completely different sequence, which might be okay if you notice that you changed up the sequence several rows back. It might be fine, and you can just change it back again and then maybe change it on purpose. You know, instead of an error, it could become a design feature. Sequence knitting is pretty cool that way. It all looks good, no matter how you mess it up, as long as you repeat the same thing often enough. Now, I will say that if you do the sequence right and then wrong and then right and then wrong, or randomly right and then wrong, it might get a little bit messy. So your next question is, okay, Nicole, well, now you've scared the heck out of me. How am I going to keep track? This is how I keep track. What I do is every couple of sequences, maybe 2 or 3 sequences, I check and make sure I've done them correctly. And I pop a locking stitch marker at the end of that sequence. And then I'll do 2 or 3 more, go back and check them from that stitch marker to my new stopping point, and put another locking stitch marker in. Do 2 or 3 more, put the stitch marker in, so that you're only ever having to go back and double check. It doesn't take that long. It takes a few seconds to go back and double check, but believe me, it's worth it, because on this scarf and this one, I spent probably a couple of hours on each one, tinking back. Tinking is knit spelled backwards. Tinking back to where I could see that I had made an error. And that really slows you down. So this will slow you down less by going back and just checking those last few sequences and dropping a locking marker in. And then you can, on the next row as you come back, you can move those markers as you need to. You can pull them off as you come to them, or you can unlock them and remove them and place them back where they belong. All right, so this was the really groovy, oh, let me hold this up closer. Here's what this sequence looks like up close. Neat, eh? On this one, which is the same marlogram pattern, I used 2 long gradients held together. Here's the 2 yarns that I used. So at one end, I've got a high contrast. And then as that gradient shifted into the purple and blue held together with still a few little splotches of the light in there, a few little splotches, less and less and less, right down to full-on purple and blue. This is the same stitch sequence as the gray one, but a different effect in the long gradient change than the gray change. Now, as you know, I'm not a big fan of loose end scarves, so I don't wear this. I've only been keeping it for teaching and demonstration purposes. Someday it will probably be given away as a gift, but it is pretty cool. I gotta say, like, you know, check it out. It's just cool. One more tip for you. When you're first doing sequence knitting, the texture of the sequences will show up much more clearly in a smooth, round yarn. Round yarns generally come from yarns that have 3 plies. 2-ply yarns tend to be a little flatter. 3-ply yarns twisted around each other tend to make a more round yarn. This particular yarn, which is Crave Caravan, up here, gorgeous. If you can get your hands on some, do it. Look at this incredible drape and the feel of it. Oh, it's just so yummy. Oscar, can you remind me what the fiber content is of the Caravan yarn? Thanks. So if you're going to play around with this, start by digging out of your stash a light-ish color, solid, round, smooth yarn, or splurge on some Crave Caravan. There are also some fantastic patterns in this sequences book. I just love these giant masterclass books that Cecelia has done. They are incredible. In this little guy, Anne of Modern Daily Knitting devised this as an improv, this little log cabin blanket using sequences. So clever. So she started in the middle with a sequence knit square or rectangle, and then just started building off of it as you do with a log cabin quilt pattern. I absolutely love this, and I want to do it. It's another one of those things, like, it drives me crazy. I just want to drop everything and do this right now. But I can't, because I have a job and YouTube. Yes, and a dog. And no, he doesn't need a cashmere dog bed. Of course, the links to both of these, both the snack sequences and the full meal sequences sources, are down in my description box. Just press on the 3 dots or the more or whatever it says under the beginning of the description of this video, and everything will be down there, as always. And if you're interested in seeing more of Cecelia Campochiaro's absolute geniusness, check out my video on magical marling. And there we have it. How's your brain? Is it partying? Yay! I say goodbye. Oscar says goodbye. Keep those needles clicking, and we'll see you next week.